Buongiorno. Thank you so much. I see the debate has already begun. And of course, the timing of being here is very propitious given the events of the last couple of weeks, not only here in Veneto, but also, of course, across Europe in Catalonia and elsewhere. It does seem that devolution is the issue of the day. So it is always an honor to come to Venice, always an honor to be in such a beautiful, historically rich city-stato, that I have, of course, been referencing in my work for many, many years. But now it is not just a beautiful visit or a timely visit, it's, of course, very politically significant. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to be with you today and to get to present some of these ideas. We are living in real time these topics that are actually thousands of years old. The question of what is the optimal size and design of the state. I've already been taking notes on this conversation, especially, Antonio, your line that the state is not like a mother. You are born with a mother and you don't have a choice about who your mother is, but a state is not like that. I will use that in the future. I will give you credit for that line. Now, let me make a brief presentation because I very much look forward to having a discussion that focuses on all of the details of the situation that you are facing. But let me give a bit of background because, after all, one of my principal messages is that the smartest governments in the world, the smartest states in the world, always learn from each other. Even those with the deepest history, the richest history, are looking horizontally at the global pattern. And that is very, very essential to me. I have the luxury of living in Singapore on the other side of the world. I'm not from there, but I live there. So I have learned a lot of lessons. But in my book, I also talk about Finland and Sweden and Switzerland and dozens of countries because it is my job as a political scientist to study all of the possible case studies. And I hope that some of what I present to you from this cross-cutting global view will be useful to you moving forward. So the book already has many titles, and I think the titles tell you a lot about the various concepts that are at play at the same time. Originally, it was called Technocracy in America. Now, this is a play on words. Everyone in America knows the very famous book by Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America. So that is exactly why I chose that title for the American edition. Now, of course, de Tocqueville, one of the most famous French narrators, scholars, journalists who traveled across America, wrote a 2-volume edition, and he celebrated the local strength of American democracy. The institutions of Washington were not really formed that well when he was traveling in America. So he was talking about the civic culture. That is what he was celebrating, and that was what the book is about. It is a reminder that if you truly believe in democracy, and that great democracy, you also celebrate local democracy. And the local democracy very often leads to devolution, the right of people to decide not only at the federal level, but at the local level, because ultimately, democracy and devolution go hand in hand. That is one of the central messages. The German edition is called Jenseits von Demokratie. That means beyond democracy. Because one of the other central issues that we are facing today is that most people in the Western world, and I do mean most average citizens, let's say, perhaps not you in this room, and perhaps not any of us once we start to talk about it, but in our default, natural way, we confuse democracy and governance. This is a big, big problem, and it is the central challenge that I have actually begun, that was the original inspiration for me doing this work. Because in political science, we have a very robust statement that it is not the type of government that matters more. It is the degree of government, right? You can have a democratic society, a democratic state that is chaotic, that is a failed state, that is ungovernable. A place like India, for example, which is where I'm actually from, is not exactly the kind of place Italy wants to be. Although, interestingly enough, the head of one of the largest parties in India is an Italian woman, as you know. So it just occurred to me that maybe that's part of the problem. Just a small joke. But I can't help it. It just occurred to me. I'm in Italy right now, and I come from India, but India has been run by an Italian for a while now. But that all changed a couple of years ago because they said, no more Gandhis, we want technocrats, we want governance. So they elected Modi, Prime Minister Modi, who was a governor, right? Someone with a provincial root, but he had a lot of experience with administration, with governance, right? And we confuse democracy with governance. Just because you're elected doesn't mean that you know how to administer, how to manage. So there's a difference between how a leader is elected and their capacity to actually lead and govern. It's very, very simple, isn't it? And yet most of us confuse it. We are so proud that we live in democratic societies, we forget to ask if we live in effective states or not. And at the end of the day, I believe that is what seems to matter more to people. Where does it all come together? It comes together in this idea of the city-state, which historically is a very robust form of political unit. Ancient Greek polities, ancient Athens, and of course, in the Middle Ages, the city-states of the Hanseatic League, and of course, Venice, Genoa, and others. Throughout time, the city has always been more important than the state, and there is no such thing as a successful state without a successful city. This is the simplest intellectual test of all that I very often use. I say, please go back through all of human history and tell me about a great state, a great empire that did not have as its actual foundation a great city. Or look around the world today. Is Afghanistan going to be a great country unless Kabul is a stable city? Probably not. Is Somalia going to be a successful country unless Mogadishu is a stable city? Probably not. Because it's very obvious that as a student of ancient diplomatic history, this is my actual academic subject, diplomacy has always been about the relations between cities. The very origins of diplomacy are the Mesopotamian city-states of the ancient Tigris and Euphrates river valleys conducting their cultural and commercial relations with each other. So I have actually tried to rename diplomacy. I call it diplomacity, so that the word city is in there, right? And I think that we have to remember that the city has always been the foundation. Or ask yourself this: countries have come and gone, empires rise and fall. The cities are still there. The oldest cities in the world, whether it is ancient Mediterranean cities, Arab cities, Asian cities, they are not named or governed by the same empire as they were thousands of years ago, but the city is still there. So it is our oldest creation, our oldest socio-political creation is the city. It is the foundation of human social and political life. It has deeper origins and deeper democratic roots and deeper knowledge of how to govern itself than any other artificial form, any other fake mother, you could say. The city knows best. The city always knows best. So that is a bit of a background. So let us move into the present right away. This is a bit of background on the crisis of the democratic state as we see it today, or rather the crisis in democracies. This is a map from The Economist magazine together with Freedom House. Freedom House is a very important NGO. and they look at the state, the quality of political systems all over the world. What have they found? They have found that around the world there is a backsliding, a reversal of the quality of democracies in much of the world today. They see that human rights protection, political freedom is in decline in many countries. Some of the reasons why that is happening is because of strongmen, right? Somewhat authoritarian, autocratic governments that's happening in Turkey, Russia, Philippines. So they may have a partially democratic process or even a fully democratic process, but then the leader who is elected reverses the freedoms of the citizens. They even find in the latest edition that the United States has become a flawed democracy. You can see how, Canada is dark green, Australia is dark green, the Scandinavian countries are dark green, but America is light green, as is France and England. Now, why is that? Well, one of the criteria is using public surveys to establish the degree of satisfaction that the citizens have with their government. In America, as you know, that is quite low. And as a result, the score, the aggregate score that America has in the latest index has gone down. It used to be dark green, now America is light green, and that is too bad. As you can see, the same is true of Italy as well. And you can see online the various methodologies. One of the main issues, of course, is the sense that government is no longer responsive to them. Again, that is the difference between being happy that you live in a democracy, but realizing that that is not good enough, right? You also want to have an effective state. So that is the next set of points here. People are increasingly dissatisfied with their governments, and that spills over into a dissatisfaction with democracy. Because if you are participating in democracy, you expect that the will of the people translates into policy, right? That politics will result in good policy. One of the problems I face in my research and writing is that in many languages, you do not have a good distinction between the word politics and the word policy. So in Germany today, they say das Policy. They've used the English word because they do not have a word for it. That is a problem right there, because for me, that is the most important distinction of all. Anyone can do politics. Even Donald Trump apparently can be in politics. But can he do policy? Aha. That seems to be a more important question. It certainly is the most important question to me. So, what you see now, if you go look at each of the lines from left to right, you see the age of the people that are surveyed. And you can see people born in the 1930s to the 1980s. In Sweden, their support for living in a democracy is going down. In Australia, down. Netherlands, down. United States, down. New Zealand, down. Britain, down. In all of the major democracies, actually, the younger the person that you ask, the less they are satisfied with their democracy. And so, as a result, you see the rise of these anti-establishment parties, right? They are fed up with the system. This is especially true, actually, in America, as you can see. The reason, I believe, has a lot to do with the fact that there are only two parties in America. Now, if you go back to The Economist and Freedom House and other academic research that ranks the quality of government, what they find is that of the top 20 governments in the world, the one thing that they all have in common is that they are multi-party parliamentary systems. You are a multi-party parliamentary system here. It's very important that there be more than one party, more than two parties. You have to have at least three or more parties. Otherwise, you have a system that is, of course, very much a duopoly, an oligopoly. You do not always have to fight and contest and defend and win voters in order to get elected. Now, multi-party democracy can feel very chaotic. It certainly can here in Italy, even in Australia, which ranks very high, but they have a new prime minister every 6 months in Australia, practically. But that's part of the process. If you can efficiently change government, then it means that you are not locking in and entrenching a one-party or two-party system that is not responsive, that is more interested in staying in power than in actually delivering. So it is a delicate balance, but we do see a very clear correlation. Better governments have to at least be multi-party systems. Getting back to the surveys, young people are asked, what if we just let the experts decide what to do and the politicians should get out of the way? That is steadily rising. They used to not actually ask this question, but they felt the need now to ask this question. And we're seeing more and more people, young people, say, yes, that's not a bad idea. There are many nuances to this research. Sometimes they ask, would you prefer a military government, a theocratic government, whatever the case may be, and you get different answers. But across the board, you see, the bottom line is, you see impatience. You see a lot of impatience. So in very common human everyday language, it's about impatience, and it's about people wanting services delivered. They don't care if you have to go through 10 elections to get there, or if you can just have a technocratic regime or something, do it. But they want to see results. It's perfectly natural, and I have a lot of sympathy for this because I have grown up in India, in the United States, in a bunch of places that are not doing such a good job right now. Let me get into some of the foundations for why I believe we have to blend the democracy that we have, the democracy that is important, the democracy that I do not want to sacrifice, with the stateness, the degree of stateness, the capacity of the state that we often call technocracy. Now, technocracy can be very often misunderstood. Some people think that just having a Chinese Communist Party is a technocracy. Or historically, when we use the word technocracy, we're actually very often referring to the Soviet Union. Well, of course, no one wants to be like the Soviet Union or Chairman Mao. Those were not technocracies in the correct definition. We were just looking for a term to balance or contrast with democracy. What we meant then is autocracy. Those were authoritarian regimes, and I don't have any sympathy for those systems. I do not defend those systems. My argument is very strongly rooted in democracy. One of the things that I push for is universal voting, in fact. So I'm hardly against democracy. But I am interested in the capacity of the state. That is what matters. Now, technocracy is an entirely European idea. It originates in 19th century France with the defeat to Prussia in the Franco-Prussian Wars of the 1860s and 70s, where the French realized that they need to strengthen the capacity of the state. They felt that they had become very complacent, and of course that was true. And so the system of Grande École and the institutions that form the modern French bureaucracy originated then. I have friends, scholars, who work in the field of political science and governance, and they use this as an example because they say that failure is, of course, the best teacher, isn't it? And it is not a surprise that when states have failed in a war, have lost a war, or experienced a revolution, that is when they get their act together. It is the awakening. Because you will not simply be disciplined with yourself if everything is going fine, right? You need to lose a war. And that's what happened to France, of course. So the idea of technocracy and technocratic institutions, the way we think about it today, is very much, if you will, intellectually a French idea. But of course, it was the Prussians who won that war, and it was the Prussian state or the German state apparatus that Max Weber was writing about in his work on the models of the state that he was trying to characterize and promote in his writings. So when we think about who are the figures that most represent this idea of focusing on governance, state capacity, institutions, design of government, we don't think so much about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Stuart Mill, those philosophers who celebrated, rightly, again, civic participation, individual enfranchisement, and so forth. But we think more about someone like Max Weber, or of course Plato, who argued that democracy itself alone, pure democracy, is the penultimate, the last stage of government before you have tyranny, because he feared, of course, the mob rule, if you will. And so he wrote, as you all know from your studies in philosophy when you were students, that he wrote about the guardians, right? The figures, if you will, the committee of leaders who could decide, who could make the decisions ultimately for the polity. Today, we are not going to replace our democratic governments with committees of experts and give up our democracy. We should never give up our democracy. But Plato's point, Weber's point, and the lesson that the French learned was certainly that experts matter, capacity matters, government design matters. Democracy is not enough. The founding fathers of the United States in the 18th century certainly agreed with this. They relied on the thinking of Plato and other political philosophers to design their government because they feared mob rule. There is a famous sentence from the Federalist Papers. There was a view, if you will, that they agreed with Plato that democracy can descend into tyranny, and that democracies eventually commit suicide, make fatal decisions. So they advocated a republican form of government. There is, again, individual enfranchisement, but leaders are entrusted with a certain capacity to make sovereign decisions. So what kind of leaders do we want to see in our system if we are trying to blend the virtue of democracy, in which anyone can stand for office, anyone can be elected, but a system where you need experts, where you need people who understand how to actually run the state? Is it the self-serving leaders that we identify as having in America? I cite research that's been very prominently verified in the United States that the members of Congress in America and the Senate in America have voted against the surveyed intentions and wishes of the people in their districts 99% of the time since the period of 1970 to 2010 when this research was done. A very, very clear-cut case that the representatives are not really representing. They're much more interested in fundraising and getting reelected. Now we have a lot of technology, a lot of social media, a lot of monitoring of what politicians do. So there are NGOs in America that can see the schedules of their congresspeople, and they put it in public on the internet. It's called the Sunlight process. Very appropriate. Sunlight provides transparency, right? Allows us to see inside. And what they found is that American congressmen spend way more time fundraising for election, to get elected and reelected and reelected. There are no term limits in America. Then they spend with their constituents, with their citizens, with their ear to the ground, learning what they need to do. And so we know this to be a fact. But in a system that I am advocating, you must also have expertise that are entrenched in a formal civil service structure. In America, the civil service professionals at the top level are always rotated out, right? No one survives a presidential election. All of the top cabinet officials, not only the top tier, the second tier, third tier, fourth tier, every ambassador on the planet Earth from America, 180 of them, must all resign. There is a professional government service, there is a civil service, but there's no one who keeps their job at a high level. That is unheard of. You would not do that in Italy, you don't do that in Brazil or Germany, not even in England, elsewhere. There are certain positions that belong to the state, right? There are administrative positions that are part of the government, the big G government, the institution of government. Not everything is political. In America now, everything, though, is political. 4,000 positions had to be appointed by Trump on day one. So far, he's apparently appointed about 300 or 400 out of 4,000, right? It should not be this way. It should not be this way. It should not be this way anywhere. That is why we have the institution of the civil service. How do you choose these people? System. So, how do you choose these leaders? I have two principles that I focus on. One is meritocracy, the other is utilitarianism. What is meritocracy? The process by which you select the qualifications that you determine to select your officials. It can be an exam, it can be the amount of experience they have, it can be how much time they spend volunteering in their community, it can be many, many things. I notice in a place like Singapore, they are changing the criteria. It used to be, did you go to Cambridge? Do you have a degree in math? Do you have a PhD? Now they're saying, hold on, how much time do you spend volunteering? Are you on the board of a school, right? They want to make sure that it is a well-rounded group of people, not just mathematicians and managers. So it's important to evolve the process of selection to make sure you are representing the virtues that you want to see in society. So it's not a fixed thing, meritocracy. Of course, this is an idea that goes back several thousand years in China through Confucianist practices and principles. Again, even in China, they are tweaking and changing and modifying the criteria. Every country should do that. The most important thing of all is utilitarianism. We live in a very unequal world, unequal countries, socio-economic disparities, haves and have-nots. What is the governing ideology? We may not agree on our ideologies. What should the role of the church be in the state, for example? Are we liberal? Are we conservative? There has to be one thing that we agree on. And I think it should be to always have a utilitarian outlook. What does that mean? Utilitarianism means that you are seeking to maximize the welfare for the largest number of people possible. Otherwise, how is it a government for the people? Is it a government for the 1%? Is it a government only for the rich? Is it a populist government that only wants to serve the interests of a specific minority, the unions, the poor, certain workers? What? How are you going to decide what is your governing philosophy? If you are a state, then your philosophy must be that your responsibility is to maximize the welfare of as many citizens as possible with your policies. And you can measure this, of course. How many children are in schools? How many people have access to medical care? All of these things. What percentage of the population feels that they are safe in their homes or walking the street at night? What is the quality of the infrastructure nationwide, right? You can measure very, very rigorously whether or not you are serving the maximum number of people. And you can objectively measure these things. So that has to be part of it. These are, to me, the two most important principles of any state. Let me move a little bit more quickly. One of the differences between the idea of legitimacy in a pure democracy versus in a hybrid system is that in democracy alone, we are again content with the input. It is a legitimate government because it was democratically elected, right? That's good enough. When you focus on governance and the quality of governance, you ask a different question. Yes, the input matters, but so do the outputs. Again, were there actual positive results? Is there progress being made? It's very, very simple. Input, output, or both? I believe both, of course. Again, democracy needs to deliver. I've talked a little bit about technology and social media. This is a new factor, of course. We don't have to wait every 4 years to know what the people want. And by the way, of course, elections are very broad. They don't really tell you what the people want. You vote for a person, you may vote for a broad platform, but do you agree with everything that the politician said on every issue? What if you agree with his or her education policy, but not his immigration policy or not his foreign policy? How are you going to differentiate these things? Well, today you don't have to wait every 4 years to have an imperfect and broad understanding of what people want. You can ask them. You can send them text messages. You can ask them on Facebook. You can have surveys, right? Singapore, which I write a lot about, has 7 parties, but only one that matters. But even if they had 0 parties, they use technology every minute. Everywhere you go, you are asked, was the service good? Did you like it? Online, you are asked. And every year, they publish in the newspapers which government agencies. So they let themselves be rated, and they publicly disclose which agencies are getting good reviews and bad reviews. So they ask people all the time, do you want more immigration? Do you want to spend more on trains? All of these questions. Do you want to eliminate the exam that children must take in the 6th grade to determine where they will go to school? They ask you everything all the time. There's really only one party to vote for, but they always ask your opinion. And then, you know what? They do it. They don't have to listen to you. You can never take power from them. I mean, I live there, I know. You can never take power from this government, but they will do everything you say because they're interested in outputs. They're interested in performance. And there's disagreements. The people don't want more immigration. The government wants more immigration. So they said, okay, you win. They block basically immigration, right? And now the economy is growing slower, and there's less young people to care for the old people, and there's restaurants that are closing. On the street that I live on, the restaurants are closing every week because they don't have enough young people to serve as waiters. And then eventually the people will see what's happening, and they'll say, uh-oh, maybe we need more immigration. And then they'll ask the people again. They don't have to wait for the next election. They'll ask you tomorrow or the next day, have you changed your mind on immigration? And the people will probably change their mind, and then they will open the borders again a little bit. That's dynamic consultation with the people. It's really very easy, isn't it? We all have a mobile phone. It can be done. It's not hard, right? And it's very cheap. We were talking earlier about the degree of the rate of participation in the referendum here last week. I said 57%. That's okay. Personally, I want 100%. I want to see 100%. There are democracies like Belgium, Australia, countries where you have 100% mandatory voting. In Singapore, it's mandatory to vote. So actually, the ruling party they only get 75, 80% of the vote, and that's okay with them, right? But 100%, and you pay a fine if you don't vote. And I think that's real democracy. How can it be a democracy if everyone isn't voting? Look at Brexit. You had, low turnout, and then 50.26 people voted for Brexit. So in terms of the population of the United Kingdom, maybe just more than 1/3, less than 40% of people just made a decision for Brexit. And they made the dumbest decision in the history of the world, right? So why not have 100%? If you trust your ideas, if you trust your leaders, if you trust your system, why not have 100% participation? In Switzerland, they're talking about lowering the voting age to 16. Why 18? 16-year-olds can drive a car in many places. Why not vote? So they're having an initiative about that. So that's very important also. Now, I won't go on and on, but you mentioned Kenichi Ome. His book has been an inspiration to me, as have quite a few others. I've said this already, but the state is always evolving. There is no end of history, as we have learned, right? There is no perfect form of government. There is an ideal type of government for the Cold War, ideal type of government for various historical periods. Today we live in the information age, And I wrote this book about what I call the info state. If we live in the information age, why don't we have a new construct, a new design of government for the information age? And it has to be focused on the optimal size, the clustering. There is, again, no successful political unit that does not have a strong urban cluster as its foundation. So that is one part of it. It has to be connected globally. It has to be part of global supply chains. How will people be educated? What sectors of the economy are you working in? How are you remaining competitive? You have to answer those questions, right? So we find that smaller countries are the most connected economies and also the most competitive economies. It has to, as I mentioned, focus on learning lessons and engaging in diplomacy with other states, this diplomacy. It has to use data, public consultation, and elections and democracy at the same time. This is not just theory. This is the reality if you look at the best practices from around the world. So I wanted to, before I started writing the book, I said, okay, hold on. What are the most successful governments or states in the world? Which are the governments that have the highest ranking for the quality of their infrastructure, their efficiency of their government, the effectiveness of their government, highest incomes, ranking in innovation, and their degree of connectedness? And I looked at the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, INSEAD. I used many studies because, of course, no one study is objective, right? You can say, oh, the World Bank has a bias towards this, and the WEF in Geneva has a bias towards that. But if you take all of these studies, surely there should be some interesting commonalities. So that's what I did. And you can see these dots. So only 2 countries in the world appear in the top 10 in all of these different categories. And those are Switzerland and Singapore. So I don't personally have a bias. I did this, by the way, years ago. I only moved to Singapore a couple of years ago, but I've been doing this research for a long time. And I lived in Switzerland like 20 years ago. But I thought, oh, this is interesting. The outcome of this research, which has nothing to do with me per se, is that Switzerland and Singapore are doing something right. And so I said, okay, I'm going to take the lessons from these 2 countries as the foundation of my analysis. Now, it's so interesting because they're both small, but they have nothing else in common. They're just small. Actually, Switzerland is a lot bigger than Singapore, actually. But they're smaller than Italy. They're smaller than America. But of course, Switzerland is a 700-year-old democracy. Singapore is 51 years old, right? In Switzerland, most people cannot name 3 or more of the 7 officials in the Federal Executive Council. They have no idea who runs their country, but it's the best run country in the world. In Singapore, everyone knows who runs the country, right? It was Lee Kuan Yew. He ran the country for 40 years, and now his son is the prime minister. So it's hard to not know who the leader is in Singapore. They're opposites in every way. One of the only things that they really had in common, I originally was thinking, was that their flags both have red and white. Other than that, they don't have a lot in common. But then I started really doing my homework. I really started researching the systems. I said, actually, it turns out that Switzerland is a lot more technocratic than people think. People think of Switzerland as a country where you take your cow and you tie it to the fence and you go and you vote in the plebiscite and you go home and you eat lots of cheese. And it's everything is run by the will of the people. And that's half the story, but everyone ignores the other half of the story, which is that they have a very qualified technocratic civil service, lots of PhDs, very rigorous approach to policy making and scenario building, very high level of investment in research and development, top quality long-term engineering and infrastructure planning. The country is actually run like a clock, like a Swiss clock. That's how you explain Switzerland. Not just because they have a plebiscite every 5 minutes, right? So half the story is missing. Now, Singapore, people think, oh, well, that is an iron-fisted regime, right? Run by the Lee family. No one else dare have a voice. That's also completely false, right? I mean, it's not completely false, but it's missing half picture, right? As I told you already, they consult the citizens on everything. They have elections, they use data, they use surveying, they have focus groups. You sit in round circles and you talk about the issues. They do it all the time. They do it in 4 languages. They even do it with the citizens who are outside the country, constantly want to know the sensitivity of the people to everything. And then they do it. That's democracy. Last time I checked, that's democracy. Listening to the people, and the people have a say. They have a say in the elections too, of course. You have 100% election turnout because it's the law. And you have a lot of political debate, a lot of debate about everything. In fact, if you think you are a country of people who complain, you should go to Singapore. They complain about everything. They are very constantly dissatisfied. When they read in the newspaper that the pension fund was returning 1.4% instead of 2%, there were protests in the public square. They demanded more transparency. They want to know the exact allocation of the pension fund. And so the government said, okay, and it's all public now, right? So it's more democratic than you think, right? A lot more. And Switzerland is more technocratic than you think. So there are virtues to the pure democratic, direct democracy model. There are virtues to the technocratic managerial model. Somewhere in between is what I call the direct technocracy. And of course, yes, how to build the most boring but effective government. Because the two things that people say, the one other thing besides the colors on the flag, when I ask people everywhere, I told people I'm writing this book, it's about governance, and I'm talking about, it turns out that Switzerland and Singapore rank very high in these categories. And so the wife of a friend of mine, a scholar, she said, "Oh, so you're writing about the 2 most boring countries in the world?" And I said, "Yes, I guess so. Perhaps that's what makes a good government. It's boring." And so if you take the best, most boring things about Switzerland and the best, most boring things about Singapore, and you put them together, you would get direct democracy meets technocracy. I call it direct technocracy. And here are some of the things you would do. You would have mandatory voting with frequent referenda of the citizens. You would be using data tools to gather feedback from people. What if we raise the price of taking the subway, right, by 25 cents? Should we do it or not do it, right? That kind of thing. Always ask people. Do we need more kindergarten places for the children or not? Right? Ask people all the time. But when you make a national decision about something like infrastructure, there's nothing more important than infrastructure, healthcare, things like this. These are 40-year decisions, 50-year decisions. Once you decide, once you agree, yes, we want universal healthcare. Yes, we want a new highway. You have to take it outside of politics and put it in an independent agency that will, in an independent way, get it done. In America, when they agree on an infrastructure bond to fund a new system of infrastructure, it's a 30-year bond. But then 2 years into the process, the Congress says, "No, we don't want to spend this," and they cancel the bond. That's ridiculous. You cannot half build a road, right? Or in this case, build 1/15 of a road. It's not the way you get things done. So some things have to be independent, and you have to plan for the future. But democracy, what is the biggest problem with democracy? Short-term. Short-term thinking by people. They just want a quick handout, right? That's why in India you can just bribe people to vote for you. And short-term thinking by leaders who just want to get elected. Who's going to think about climate change? Who's going to think about infrastructure? Who's going to think about education policy? Someone has to do it. But if that person is only there for 4 years, no one will do it. So you have to blend these models. You must. Your societies will fail if they don't do it. That's what's happening right now, after all. Small states do this better. The margin for error in a small country is very close to zero. You make a bad decision, it's fatal, right? You're done, finished. It's a very, very cruel world. So I noticed that in small states, they're very, very cautious, careful. They think about their economic and their political geography. They want to be competitive. They plan their economy. They select good leaders. They focus on livability, all of these things. Small states. It's not just the Scandinavian states, but you see it in New Zealand, you see it in Singapore. Small countries are doing better. It's not just countries, but again, cities, of course, city-states, right? It's Dubai, it's New York City, and so forth. So I won't go into all the details, but there's so many brilliant policy innovations I see coming from city-states, from small countries, whether it comes to digitization of public services, whether it comes to the ways in which they're making investments in education, all of these kinds of things that are going on. And remember that, again, as I said, the most important thing is that small countries want to learn from other countries, right? Cities do best when they learn from other cities. So Singapore, the reason Singapore became Singapore, because it used to be a very poor country when it was independent 50 years ago, they studied the Dutch. The Dutch had done a lot of land reclamation. Singaporeans realized, oh my goodness, we're such a tiny, tiny, tiny island. We need to reclaim land. Let's learn it from the Dutch. They said, we need a really good civil service. Let's look at the Royal Dutch Shell Company, right? They copied in so many ways. They hired Dutch people. You know, you can look at pictures from the 1950s. Lee Kuan Yew is standing there with Dutch executives who came and spent years in Singapore helping him build the country. Right? Small countries. And what we see so interesting, small cities today, places like Hamburg and New York, are saying we have to protect our migrants. Let's give them documents. Let's make them legal. Let's give them the right to vote in local elections. We need these people. We need their voice. Always interested in attracting talent. Thinking about the future matters a lot, as I said. So you see more and more small countries and governments that are appointing future ministers, a minister for the future. This just happened in the United Arab Emirates. In Singapore, it's interesting. Every agency has to have a futurist. They have to have scenario planning embedded in the team. There isn't a future minister. It's like everyone there is a future minister. People think this is impossible. This can be done. I will not talk about this in detail. This is my redesign of the American federal government. I just want to say that this was not easy to do. You can get assassinated for making a chart like this in America. I mean, maybe not really, but this is dangerous stuff. Because I'm tinkering with things that have been there for hundreds of years. And that's the problem. They've been there for hundreds of years. No one wants to fix it. One of my ideas, I'll just talk about one, is I want to get rid of the Senate. So obviously there are some people who don't like that idea. I can think of 100 people specifically who don't like that idea. But you should replace it with the governors. Why? Because governors know how to administer, right? Governors who have been running a budget, running a bureaucracy, managing services. America has 535 representatives, right? 100 senators plus 435 congressmen. There are 535 people who pretend that they represent the people. Everyone wants to represent. Everyone's legitimacy is based on representing. What about governing? What about actually doing something? The most popular politicians in America today, by far, are the governors of the states and the mayors of the cities. By far. The least popular, by far, are, of course, the congressmen, right? That has a lot to do with this argument, right? Administration versus representation, right? So anyway, there's many other reforms that I would propose for the United States. Let's talk about Europe, and then I'll conclude. Europe is, remember, historically, in the recent decades, the world's greatest experiment in devolution and aggregation. This is the core argument of connectography, really. That the world has more countries than ever before. Countries are getting smaller and smaller because we have finite space. But therefore, we are becoming these regional federations like the European Union. There is no more sophisticated regional supranational entity in the world than the European Union. It's very important to remember this as a foundation for whatever happens in a place like Veneto, right? Because the pattern of history that is happening around the world is that regionalism is becoming more important. So I know, of course, Catalonians, Scots, they've all said, if we become independent, we apply to join the European Union. We apply to join Brussels. And that's why, remember that when I am defending movements like Veneto, like Catalonia, like Scotland around the world, I always say they are not tribal. They are the most global people. The most global people are the Venetians. The most global people are the Catalans. The most global people are the Scots. Because they are thinking beyond just the state, the mother, the fake mother. They are thinking about the whole world that they want to connect to the European Union, to other trade partners around the world. So there's nothing tribal about it. Identity matters. Of course, identity politics matters. But the word tribalism has such a negative connotation, of course. But when I think of Venetians, I don't think of tribal people, right? So this is a misperception that has to be corrected when I'm talking about this elsewhere. So widening and deepening, right? The European Union is going to survive. It has survived the financial crisis. It's going to continue to expand. More countries want to join. The Balkan countries want to join, for example. But it will also deepen. There will be more coordination. So you have to think about, if you are independent, what are the things you want to coordinate? Who do you want to coordinate with? Are you going to, of course, keep the euro currency and have an independent relationship with the European Central Bank? Who is going to provide your military and defense functions? Are you going to have a separate independent telecommunications company? So I look at the examples like the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, together with countries that were not under Soviet occupation, like Finland and Sweden. They've begun to share their banking services, their telecom services, their energy infrastructure. There is a marketplace of governance services, and you have to find low-cost, effective partners. It doesn't have to be contiguous countries. It can be anyone. That's what is possible today. So each of these questions you have to answer, because of course you will be more fiscally responsible than Italy is. It's hard to not be more fiscally responsible, one might say, because I would never deny that identity is important in these issues. It's important in Scotland. It's important in Kurdistan. I have more sympathy for the Kurds than anyone, because for thousands of years they have been denied independence, and I've spent quite a bit of time in Kurdistan. So, identity matters, but it's also about money, right? So I try to be objective. I try to be neutral, as an academic looking at each situation. You know what? The common denominator is not that the identity issue is number one. The common denominator is that money is extremely important in all of this, right? So fiscal, who can claim that they are going to be the stewards of the state's cash and finances? And I think that is the most powerful argument, of course. And you are correct here to make that argument. You lead with that argument. You count how much money you pay in, you count how much money you get back. And you are demanding, you say, how long will it take to clean up the finances in Rome? Why are they so inefficient? This is the same thing in America. In California and in Seattle in the state of Washington, they're saying, wait a minute, we will raise our local taxes, and the people here want to have the local taxes raised because they see we spend it on affordable housing, we spend it on better roads, we spend it on better schools. When we send that money to Washington, it never comes back. And of course, this is what you're saying as well. So if you can prove to your people, and in California, same thing. California, taxes have gone up. New York City, where I'm from, taxes have gone up. Seattle, taxes have gone up because those are well-run places. They have proved to their people locally, provincially, that they know how to manage the money. And so the people said, yes, so you can raise our taxes. But the capital, Washington, Rome, they don't trust you. I will give you a time. You can do it. You can have a timeline. We don't know how these negotiations will play out here or in Catalonia, but you can give a timeline. You can say, if you do not decrease the per capita expenditure and inefficiency in the transport sector or the healthcare sector in the next 5 years, we will, 5 years from now, reduce our payments by this percent. For example, you could have done that 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Maybe it's part of the negotiation now. I don't know. But this is how, because governments have to learn. You don't want Italy to collapse, right? You want Italy to get better at being Italy. Catalans want to secede, some of them, from Spain, but they don't want Spain to collapse. But they have a very correct observation that the state is not run well. So competition, again, I'm trying to be an objective political scientist. The greatest motivator in history for people and for societies is competition. Right? You have to create competition that says, I'm challenging you to get better. Otherwise, I will beat you. Right? That's what motivates us as humans. That's also what motivates states. So that competitive dynamic, by having this referendum, you are creating a competitive dynamic. What are they going to offer you to stay on the team? Right? I like humanistic analogies, right? Social analogies, because international relations is in many ways like that. But let's never forget, this is my final point, that there is also not a centralization process, but a regional coordination process that matters a lot, and that is Europe. Whatever happens between Veneto and Italy, Europe matters to me most of all, because really, in my field, my specialization is international relations and geopolitics, right? All of my books have been in this field. And that's the big picture. And in that big picture, you realize one thing. Small countries don't matter, right? On their own. Even Germany is not a superpower, right? So Europe matters. My first book, I Tre Imperi, was about this idea of empires and superpowers. That's how you have an impact. So whatever happens with Italy, remember that Europe is ultimately your home. And having a strong Europe rests on having a strong Italy, a strong Spain, a strong Germany, but coordinating these functions, whether it's monetary policy, fiscal compact, banking union, foreign policy. Europe too has to be more efficient at these things, but it can only be efficient at these things if it is a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. And it has many parts. It used to have just 12 parts, now it has 27, 28 parts, maybe one day it will have 35 parts. Coordination gets harder, but in a world where you have China and India as emerging superpowers, no one in Europe can pretend that they are important on the world stage unless you are truly part of Europe, and Europe is effective as well. So, grazie. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you. Thank you.